Hello and welcome back to Political Commentary Corner. I'm your host, Lawrence Grand Prix. Today we have a part one of what is likely to be a two-part episode given the amount of material we have to cover on this topic spans multiple decades and requires some in-depth analysis, and that is Northwest Baltimore, the community known as Park Heights, and the political situation in Baltimore's 41st District. And the desire to do this episode goes back a while now. But one of the things that crystallized it for me was seeing, and if you're from Baltimore, you may know this map, the judgmental map of Baltimore. It is a map of Baltimore replete with stereotypes of different neighborhoods. So it has hipsters in certain neighborhoods. It has multiple neighborhoods that are seen as scary or dangerous. And the idea is to be politically incorrect. And it reflects a lot of the preconceived notions of stereotypes that many outside the city and frankly many inside the city hold. But in Northwest Baltimore, there is a neighborhood known as Park Heights, upper and lower. Lower is more predominantly black, upper is predominantly mixed, but there's a large Jewish population, large Orthodox Jewish population. And in this judgmental map, the area between those two neighborhoods, one is marked as the Wire, the other one marked as Israel, is called the West Bank. And given the rise of settler violence in the West Bank as the ceasefire, which is not really a ceasefire in the Gaza Strip, continues on, this idea of this neighborhood in Baltimore as a intermediate zone, a West Bank being encroached upon by the ability of another group to influence what happens there in terms of the security, the policing, the quality of life of the individuals there. It really resonated with me. So I think that conceptually, one thing we've tried to do is try to push some of the energy around anti-Zionist protest, in addition to it going to D.C., thinking about overseas, seeing how this notion of racialized social control and the political machines that produce the support for Zionism abroad also have serious implications for us here in Baltimore. As we'll talk about, the former head of AIPAC lives in the Baltimore region and has a lot of political clout that impacts some of the policies and media environment we have locally. And this is designed to have a conversation about Northwest Baltimore beyond an individual political race, that we will talk about the race for state senate in Northwest Baltimore, or even an individual political scandal. There is a political indictment of an existing state senator, Dahlia Attar, has been indicted for accusations of sort of being part of this scheme to blackmail a political opponent. And the reality is what's happening here is much deeper than any individual political scandal, any sensationalist details, and wanting to talk about that situation, but talk about it in the context of the larger power dynamics and political theories and thinking that are actually reflected in that scandal. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. We're going to put it in the larger context of this notion of a political machine desiring to extend its control over a region, a predominantly black region, over 60% black by many estimates, that has a lot of political power by people that are not of that community, that are actually producing political impacts that could hurt that community, and actually having some historical insight for those dynamics. So again, we thank you. Go to lbsbaltimore.com, sign up for our email, so we'll give you all the details about the race in the 41st District, the candidate that we've endorsed, Malcolm Ruff, candidate that he's running against, Dahlia Attar, who's been federally indicted, but also some of the history of our engagement around these issues. And also continue to check us out on the Black Liberation Media YouTube network and all the other great shows on the network. So with that, let's get started. Two, three, drop it. What you're about to hear is audio from a video that was taken of a police stop that happened in Northwest Baltimore between a white police officer and two black individuals in late 2025.
Yeah, what's your reason to stop me? You ain't even got no reason to stop him, bro. Hey, yo, walk off. How did you hit the alley, yo? Go ahead, Trey, walk off, bro. He beating. You ain't even got no reason to stop him. Hey, yo, what the f***? You gonna hit him with the car? Yo, what the f***, bro? Yo, hey, yo. Come back this way, yo. You crashing it all that. You really crashing up.
So as you heard, this is a video of the police coming up to two black folks, telling them to move along. The phrase he uses is take a lap. When people object, saying we wasn't doing nothing, this is harassment, the police officer, in the words of the person in the video, crashes out, gets in his car, starts chasing the individual around, basically threatening to hit them with their car to the point where they eventually crash their police car. So the fact that this happens in Northwest Baltimore, in a community that has a history of stop and frisk policing, of unconstitutional policing, and has this political dynamic where you have folks who are from this community that traditionally have supported more tough on crime policies, more pro-police policies, despite the fact that the people most disproportionately negatively impacted by those policies are the people from Lower Park Heights. But the disproportionate voting bloc of the people from Upper Park Heights supports these tough on crime policies. And I wanted to start here because this is the result of this political power imbalance. And this is where all the abstractions about Zionism and political donations and corruption and accusations of political machinations, the impact is people's lives are on the line. And I want to really center that because this can feel like two competing political cliques, a story of political intrigue, backdoor deals, abstractions. And the goal is to center the impact that these power dynamics have determining life outcomes for people, not just in terms of potentially running folks over with cars, but the money it takes to have a police force that is empowered to do that, the money it takes to buy the cars, to pay people to be consistently out on patrol, the dynamics of having individuals who have this inclination to crash out, to potentially hit someone with cars, be employed by the city nominally, paid by the tax dollars of the citizens, to treat them as if they're an occupied force, that they're being occupied by the people who are supposed to protect them. And the parallels between this incident of policing, where individuals are exceeding their mandate, sort of acting on their own accord, and the incident of corruption, accused corruption, and the machinations, again, in this political district, are actually surprisingly made by none other than Fox 45. So if we actually listen to a Fox 45 video, they actually do the work for us of connecting this incident to the incident of accused wrongdoing of the political machine that is in the Northwest Baltimore City area. So let's listen to this Fox 45 clip.
Two developing stories today highlighting police officer controversies in Baltimore City. First, a viral video shows Robert Parks, a 5-year veteran of the force, attempting to hit a man with his patrol car. Baltimore police say he's on paid administrative leave.
And Officer Kalman Finkelstein is named in a federal indictment for extortion and conspiracy charges. Finkelstein is listed as a co-conspirator alongside State Senator Dahlia Attar and her brother Joseph Attar in an alleged scheme dating back to 2020. According to the indictment, Senator Attar, who represents Baltimore City, feared a political consultant was out to get her and planned to send out mailers to the Jewish community, focusing on her voting record.
Prosecutors say the plot began when Finkelstein and Attar's brother entered the consultant's apartment while she was away, installing cameras and planting a tracking device on her car. The indictment goes on to say the cameras were used to secretly film the consultant in bed carrying on an affair with a married man in order to threaten them with exposure. Fox 45's Alexa Ashwell looked into the histories of both these officers facing scrutiny and joins us live with what she's learned. Alexa.
Finkelstein had been on administrative duty since 2022, pending the outcome of this federal investigation that's now resulted in his indictment. A deeper look into his past shows a 2021 crash. According to online records, Finkelstein ran a red light while in his patrol car without the proper use of its siren or emergency lights at the intersection of North Caroline and East Baltimore streets. Finkelstein colliding with a civilian car. The city just this past May paying just under $400,000 to 3 teenagers seriously injured in the crash. Baltimore Police Commissioner Richard Worley.
It is not what we want our officers doing.
Questioned on both officers.
We know about the investigation.
And on concerns over public trust.
The best thing we can do is what we've been doing is be transparent. We saw it. We don't like it.
So again, you have Officer Robert Parks, who was the individual driving the car, the police officer, in the incident where they tried to run over a black man, but you also have the police officer accused of helping in this political blackmail scheme also being investigated for having a car crash incident where they were chasing individuals and had to give almost a $500,000 settlement for the accident they had. And I think this again should be read as an example of that politically incorrect judgmental map of Baltimore expressing some sort of truth. That just as you have a buffer zone between the Nation of Israel and the West Bank that requires a degree of policing and a political power differential between people overseas, you have a domestic colony of Northwest Baltimore, Park Heights, that is being engaged by a group that has a disproportionate political power and using that power to produce policing. So while reports are a little sketchy, some people said that the individual had an open warrant out on them and that's why the police was engaging. The video explicitly shows the officer saying, "Take a lap." And this idea, why would you say that? What is that phrase? The idea that black folks congregating in public space, just them being visible, is itself some sort of threat, is itself some sort of violation, or produces fear and anxiety in terms of other people seeing those black folks congregating. This is something we've seen consistently in our examination of the local conservative media, whether it's Penn North, folks being outside, being described as zombies, looking for drugs. The very presence of black people in public space is a stimulus to anxiety. And there isn't a solution of humanizing folks, engaging them. The solution is to deploy not services, not things investing in the community. The solution is to use the police. This idea that any aggregation of folks needs to be engaged through policing to disrupt the ability for people to occupy public space because they're seen inherently as a threat. This is reminiscent of the very presence of black and brown people, whether in Baltimore or occupied Palestine, being needed to be dispersed, being needed to be separated, being needed to be seen as something, a problem to be dealt with through violence or policing presence. And I think that whether it's the increasing development that's happening in the Northwest Baltimore corridor, the idea of wanting a secure space, a secure buffer zone between, again, this more affluent, politically powerful Northwest Baltimore community requires a degree of policing of the buffer zone specifically. And this is part of the connection we're trying to make between the logic of Zionism abroad and the reality folks are facing here on the ground, given what we understand about the connections. Another connection. We have a consent decree here in Baltimore. This individual officer was charged with attempted murder. And in that procedural illusion of justice, because we see this dynamic is pervasive with Carmen Finkelstein, the officer accused of helping in the alleged blackmail scandal, also having a car crash, despite on paper procedurally not being supposed to engage in these chases. So we have the consent decree, we have this illusion of procedural justice, but the reality we all know on the ground is a continuing pervasive ability to get away with abuse because of the power differential in holding these folks accountable. That, to me, is very similar to the West Bank, where on paper, procedurally, these settlements are not legal. Procedurally, you have the ability to remove settlers, to remove the organs of policing and violence that comes with those settlers, be it with the Israeli occupation force or settler vigilantes continuing to police these areas. But on paper, we all know that the lack of power of the individuals being subject to this policing and military occupation means that that's just on paper. That doesn't mean that nothing good has come of the consent decree, that there aren't improvements, but the gap between the ability to deploy procedural justice on paper and create the illusion of a legitimation of that policing regime because it's seen as having this procedural veneer of justice to it, to me, again, shows the reality of needing to have this lens of looking internationally, looking in an internal colonial frame, and seeing Northwest Baltimore within that context, within the context of replicating power differentials and neocolonial violence, in this case, within the context of here domestically within the United States. Lest we be accused of proffering in tropes, it is not our analysis that Carmen Finkelstein is someone who represents a political power. It is something that has been reported upon independently by local Baltimore journalists. So again, this is an Orthodox Jewish cop who was involved in the alleged blackmailing of the individual who was a potential opponent to Senator Dahlia Tarr. So this is a write-up that the Baltimore Brew, a local journalistic outlet, did on Coleman Finkelstein a few years ago when he was taken off of public duty for the traffic incident. So it says, quote, "Officers are specifically prohibited from pursuing a car if the initial violation is a crime against property, such as a stolen vehicle or misdemeanor traffic offense. Police are known to get around the no-pursuit policy by chasing a vehicle without lights or sirens," according to a veteran officer, who said Finkelstein was well known in the northern and northwestern districts for flouting the rules. "He's got an in with the politicians. Anyone else doing this, they'd be in big trouble and would be terminated immediately," said the officer. Finkelstein remains on the police force. According to payrolls, he earned $76,500 in fiscal 24 and $71,000 in fiscal 23. The BPD press office did not respond to questions about the settlement or the job status. Finkelstein holds a unique position in the department, celebrated as the only Jewish Orthodox member since the 1960s. He also came under criminal investigation independent of this traffic accident. In July 2022, the BPD executed a search warrant for his property and his possessions, according to WJZ. His interest in law enforcement apparently stems from his involvement in the Shomrim. The Orthodox Jewish Crime Watch group conducts patrols in northwest Baltimore and Pikesville and are loosely coordinating with city and county police. The group became a focus of interest in 2017 when it was gifted a city patrol vehicle by former Mayor Catherine Pugh at the urging of newly elected Councilman Isaac Yitzhak Schleifer. At the time, the group came under criticism for alleged improper stops of black motorists traveling through Orthodox neighborhoods. Finkelstein's own political fortunes opened up in 2018 when he was elected to the 41st District Democratic State Central Committee, which required him to vacate the committee seat in 2019 after he was sworn in police officer. Between 2019 and 2025, the officer donated $36,500 to Democratic candidates and office holders. Among his biggest donations were to Councilman Yitzhak Schleifer, $8,500, end quote. So let's take a look at what we really have here. An individual that formerly works with the local community, Jewish communities, community watch group, the Shomrim, that has enough political support to get an SUV donated to them by the former mayor with the support of the councilperson from that district. This group has documented incidences of abusing and threatening individuals who are black walking through the community. We'll talk about that later. But in addition to that, they join the police force and are able to use the political support that they've given to the same city council person to be able to get away with aggressive, heavy-handed policing tactics, including potentially engaging in this incident of potential political blackmail. Again, the parallels between Baltimore and the West Bank seem here to be very strong because we have, just as you have settlers who patrol their communities and potentially engage with individuals in that community in occupied Palestine, you have individuals here using their political power to, again, informally in the case of the Shomrim, and formally in the case of the police, have these incidences of engaging community in ways that show a disproportionate use of coercion because of the political power they have. And again, this is an individual with a track record of disobeying the rules in a way that put people in danger, but they're able to get away with it because of the political power they have. Does that sound familiar to anyone? So the last thing I want to say, because I don't want to forget it, in the actual FBI files for the corruption case, accusations that Finkelstein is accused of being engaged with, when they say this individual was potentially going to hurt Senator Tarr, in the correspondences that are revealed in the FBI file, Senator Tarr specifically says what she's afraid of is mailers going out to people in her district. So you literally can pay for mail to go to people about a politician's political record that you may not like and basically tell people they did something bad, don't vote for them. What was the mailer she was afraid of? In the FBI file explicitly says the mailer she was specifically afraid of was an attack on her not being supportive enough of police by voting for relatively minor police reform legislation in the aftermath of George Floyd 2020-2021. This all happens around 2022. That's why he was arrested in 2022, which is, we now know, because of his potential involvement in this accusation of a blackmail scheme. So this is really important because the community has so engaged and imbibed a fear of the others around them that they're willing to go potentially, with the accusation, extreme lengths to continue to bone up on the bona fides of being pro-police. This idea of social control and force being so important to the stability psychologically of the community that feels as if they are bordered by a hostile community, that just the mere possibility of mailers going out saying you voted for police reform could allegedly lead to such an intense political response. It is an incredible example that this is deeper than a sex scandal. This is about a community's collective thinking about what is security, which raises another question. Let's talk some more about the Shomrim. What is the Shomrim, and what relationship do they have with police? So as stated, this is a community watch group that has such a deep relationship with police. I'm actually going to play a clip for you of a video the Shomrim has posted online a few years ago about dinners they actually have held with the Baltimore City and County Police, in which the police are so laudatory of the Shomrim, they're basically like calling them an extension of the police. So here's actually video from the dinners the Shomrim has with police.
Shomrim of Baltimore started in 2005 as a community group trying to help the community with quality of life issues. We became the eyes and ears of the police department in a situation where there was a lot of burglaries in town, and we were of the understanding that the police can't be everywhere at all times. So instead of just complaining, we felt that if we can be part of the solution, that would make a difference. 4 years later, our working relationship with the Baltimore City Police and the Baltimore County Police has been really amazing.
First, I want to start saying I really appreciate all the work that you guys do. I mean, you do incredible work here in the Northwest, and I really appreciate everything that you guys do, because you've been working very well in identifying crime issues, suspicious people, and people breaking into homes, and people going into yards and stuff like that. So I'm in your corner. I've always been in your corner. I really, really, really love having you guys, and the relationship that I have with you guys has been really, really good.
This is not the most original point, but I feel I need to make it. Can you imagine anything similar in terms of the laudatory nature of this conversation being had for a black group, which had armed patrols of its own community? I would say, in fact, we've run that example when we had things like the Black Panthers in our community. Now, that were trying explicitly to clean up the community, to deal with the infusion of drugs and gangsterism in our community, in addition to watching the cops, holding the cops accountable for the abuse of the police. They weren't exactly met with this sort of laudatory engagement. They were met with overwhelming force from not just the FBI, but also local police departments, having shootouts with, infiltrating, and attempting to destroy similar efforts from the black community to have armed community self-defensive patrols. But now let's look at an incident that'll be well known to many folks in the audience, but some folks who maybe not from Baltimore, maybe weren't around 10 years ago. It's important to remember the incident of the attack on Corey Osby that happened soon after the incident with Trayvon Martin's. This was around 2013, right after the incident with the murder of Trayvon Martin by George Zimmerman. There was this increasing understanding of white vigilantism masquerading as self-defense and community watch. So similar to the incident with Trayvon Martin, you have an individual who is black walking through a predominantly white neighborhood. This was this 3200 block of Falls Road. When they see Corey, who was then 15, members of Shomrim, specifically the Werdesheen brothers, engage Corey. There's conflicting analysis about what happened in terms of They claimed self-defense. Corey claimed that he was targeted. But what we do know is that he ended up with a broken wrist. So let's actually play a little bit from protests that happened at the time when the then state's attorney for Baltimore City, Greg Bernstein, the person who preceded Marilyn Mosby, actually is beginning to adjudicate the case and actually drop some of the most severe charges against one of the brothers. So here is audio from a news story done about this case.
Some protesters are questioning how the Baltimore City State's attorney is handling a number of issues, including the prosecution of the case against two Jewish brothers accused of assaulting an African-American teenager.
Outside Mitchell Courthouse in downtown Baltimore, members of the Black Media Group, along with civil and human rights activists, called on the city state's attorney to clarify his handling so far of the case against 23-year-old Eli Werdesheim and his brother Avi.
The perception is that this is not being handled in the way that it would normally be handled if this was a case between an African-American in reverse.
No justice, no peace. Around the corner, a group of protesters also called for a response. They also want the Citizens on Patrol group, Shamrim, disbanded. Last week, prosecutors dropped the felony first-degree assault charge against Eli Werdesheim, but he and his brother Avi face assault and other misdemeanor charges. They were accused in the November 2010 beating of a 15-year-old African-American boy. The teen claims he was attacked while walking along Falstaff Road in a predominantly Jewish neighborhood. He was hit in the head with a radio and suffered a broken wrist. Eli Werdesheim claims he acted in self-defense. He was part of Shamrim. The group suspended him after the incident. The state's attorney says he will not comment on any pending case.
I don't think it's fair to the victim, and I don't think it's fair to the defendant in any kind of case. It's important that we prosecute cases in the courtroom.
Again, does anything about this case feel familiar? You have an individual claiming self-defense, engaging a person, and having this disproportionate use of force. And not only are they given a slap on the wrist, in this case, the most severe case is being dropped, but it's claimed that we have to protect the individual who's accused. So rather than focusing on the power imbalance between this entity that has so much political support that they can get an SUV donated to them by the mayor because of their substantial political financial support of the community watch to their city council person, you have a discussion of, well, we have to protect the rights of the accused. One of the things that the reports say is that the Werdesheim brothers saw Corey and said, "Didn't I see you from Park Heights? You're not supposed to be here." Again, what does that sound like? It sounds like a regime where individuals are ascribed particular zones where they're allowed to be. And if you exceed the zone where you're supposed to be, you can be subject to extrajudicial violence and extrajudicial policing. And this is here in Baltimore, but it sounds a lot like what happens in the occupied Palestinian territories, where you have individuals that can't enter into Israel without passes. Another example of this comes from a WBAL story from 2012, where they talk about the Jewish community's response to the accusations against the brothers. So it says, quote, Avi and Eli Werdesheim entered pleas Wednesday mornings through supporters and protesters rallied outside the Mitchell Courthouse. Police said the victims in the case told them that 23-year-old Eli Werdesheim struck him in the head with a radio while he was walking along Falstaff Road. The teen said the 23-year-old shouted, "You don't belong around here. Get out of here." Eli and Avi, 20, were charged with false imprisonment, assault, and weapons charges on November 19th. Outside of the courthouse, members of the Jewish communities rallied in support of the Werdesheims. They are wonderful guys. I know they would only do the right thing in whatever circumstance they are in. Now, I don't want to push the analogy too far, but we also see protests in Israel when individuals are accused of using excessive force, saying they have to use the force because that's how we protect the community. So rather than having a judicial process where people are adjudicated in terms of their guilt or innocence, you have a community that basically says we need to protect the right of individuals to use the force they need because we have to protect the community. And this obsession with securitization, again, to me is part of the root of the political support for more conservative Democrats in northwestern Baltimore, particularly folks coming out of this community that have this relationship to an anxiety and fear for their safety, that they feel that we have to constantly support even the most heavy-handed applications of force, be it Finkelstein's continual flaunting of the rules when he was a cop, because he gave all them donations, the Shamrim, the Werdesheim brothers. This is a pattern. And the point of this podcast is to point out those patterns and to see the current political campaign, the accusation of corruption, as part of a community having a pattern of being willing to flaunt the rules in order for continual application of force because of this anxiety and fear for its security. Now you may be asking, what is the implication of all of this? Why should I care if I don't live in Northwest Baltimore? I think it's an example of the Democratic Party, its relationship to public resources, being willing to place them in containers for social control, for policing, for communities that are willing to reflect a vision that is pro-police, but it will challenge them and they have accusations of corruption or double dealing when communities are trying to shift those power dynamics to resources that aren't pro-police, that are pro-community. Again, you have Yitzi getting the SUV for the Community Watch Group after claiming he had no relationship to the mayor getting the SUV. Also, apparently, it wasn't just an SUV for the Sham Ream. There are other stories talking about them getting a $250,000 ambulance for a community group in the Jewish community that's doing alternative response to health emergencies. So we have the ability of this community to produce resources for them to build up their own capacity to deal with their own needs. And that, in the abstract, could be good. But we see it's tied to this specific potential quid pro quo, but this obsession with control and policing that makes their calls for resources viable and acceptable in ways that our calls for resources are demonized. Finally, for me, I think it's important to understand that this security frame creates an insatiable demand for more. Once you give some, they're going to keep coming back. They're going to weave themselves even more deeply with the police, with the security architecture, to the point where they're going to be able to get even more resources. Here's another news article. Basically, the Sham Ream is building out a ecosystem of electronic surveillance. So they're building up a network of security cameras, and they want to weave that network in with the police's network of security and digital surveillance to the point where they become an extension of a surveillance state, which then can deploy the violence of the police department to secure their community. So here's a news article from just a couple years ago.
So this is called Operation Community Watch, and it's put on by a group called Shomrim, and it involves setting up a network of cameras like this one you see on homes in this neighborhood, so when a crime does happen, police can easily get their surveillance video.
I think it's a great deterrent. I'm sure it helps solve crimes as well.
Ezra Fromowitz lives along Green Spring Avenue. That's why he's happy to hear about Operation Community Watch. It's a program put on by a neighborhood safety group called Shomrim. It involves placing a network of high-quality cameras on homes and businesses in this neighborhood. And if a crime happens, Shomrim will turn the video footage over to police.
Seeing that there was a problem, we wanted to be part of the solution. And what we found was if we could get together main intersections or major areas of foot traffic or community engagement, if we could put cameras in those locations, those could be resources to both the homeowners and to law enforcement.
Nate Wilner works with Shomrim. He says the program was partly sparked by a recent spike in carjackings around Baltimore City.
We understand the police cannot be everywhere. We need to be part of the solution, and the community-police relationship is key to public safety.
Homeowners and businesses have to opt into the program, and Wilner says that within the first week, more than 60 homeowners have already requested the cameras. Now, Shomrim is looking to get funding to install them all. Fromowitz hopes it makes a difference and keeps criminals away.
A criminal would probably think, twice, 3 times if they know that there are people who care about the safety of the community and are doing things about it, and they're, watching and their eyes around.
And Shomrim said that they're looking to get part of that funding from local and the state government.
Remember that last part of the news story, state and local money. So we have a group that's looking not just to do community watch, understandable, but to specifically use state and local money to build themselves out as an extension of the police force. I think that is just an example of the mentality of a group that's trying to use the political power they have to make themselves indispensable to a machine of policing that itself has its own political power with the Fraternal Order of Police and this entire regime of tough-on-crime right-wing Democrats that are using communities' anxieties about crime. Listen to what they say in this news story. We know the cops can't be everywhere. That's the exact same thing they said to dealing with the police, and that was like over 10 years before this news story comes out. So this is a playbook recycled over and over again because we're just looking to help out the police. We're looking to help out our community. But this anxiety, this fear of crime becomes a political cudgel with which they can not only bludgeon folks like us who are pushing for common sense criminal justice reform, things like making it so that you can't interrogate youth without them having legal counsel, which conservative Democrats, including folks like Senator Dahlia Tarr, claimed went too far and made made so police can't talk to young people, and therefore they can just clam up and we can't get information if a young person is about to be a victim of a crime. This is ridiculous. There are exemptions in the law. But the environment, the mentality that this community watch comes from, is one of that desire to create a political panic around crime, despite, as we've talked about earlier, historic declines in crime produced by things like grassroots violence prevention. But this is not about reality. This is about an ideology. This is about a political machine that views these anxieties as a tool to get public resources and a tool to wield political power. Which begs the question, who are some of the folks operating this political machine? So who are Ronnie Rosenbluth and Isaac Gitzi Schleifer? Well, for one thing, they are apparently cousins. And Rosenbluth is a founder and was president of the Shomrim. And this is important because Gitzi, when he was elected to the city council, though he claims he wasn't, many people claim he was a member of the Shomrim, and it was revealed that he helped to get the donation that paid for the SUV for the Shomrim from then Mayor Pugh, which would potentially be a violation of ethics where individuals who are parts of organizations are supposed to recuse themselves from advocating on behalf of city resources going to said organizations. Now, we know things are messy and complicated when it comes to public money going to organizations. It's a small city, things like that. But it will become important later because of some of the particular stances Gitzi takes in relationship to when other people do what he's accused of doing in terms of supporting public money for institutions that do work in community. But let's focus on Mr. Rosenbluth. So in this Baltimore Brew article from 2017, it explains his role as being part of this larger network of folks wielding political influence from Northwest Baltimore, how that ties in with the Shomrim, and another player who I think went in part one talking about the surprise appearance of someone who folks may remember from the aughts in the Bush administration. But I think it's important to talk about him in the context of the tie between this political network and Zionism. And again, folks may have relationships with these folks. They may say, you know, these folks can be a lot, but they can do good stuff. But when you start tying yourself to folks who really do things that and make stances that are deeply, deeply dangerous, I think this becomes an issue of beyond local politics and backslapping and good old boys and boys will be boys or girls will be girls. It becomes really, do you have a political stance against being tied to people that really help to instigate some of the deepest, darkest, violent impulses of America when it comes to Zionism and when it comes to the violence in the Middle East. But let's not go too far down the line. Let's read this quote from the Baltimore Brew around Ronnie Rosenbluth and the political machinations in Northwest Baltimore. This is from 2017. Quote, Ronnie Rosenbluth is the founder and until last month, 2017, the president of the Shomrim Patrol Group. But Rosenbluth, as Northwest Baltimore insiders know, is also the older cousin of that councilman, Isaac Gitzi Schleifer. That relationship is one example of the close ties between the freshman 5th District councilperson and the Orthodox Jewish Neighborhood Watch Group. Schleifer says he isn't and never has been a member of the Shomrim, asked why he then was given a certificate of appreciation as a, quote, Baltimore Shomrim dispatcher by the San Francisco Police Department. Article 8, Subtitle 6 prohibits participation of Baltimore City Code says public officials may not participate and must disqualify themselves from any matter This official has an interest in the matter, but a disqualifying relative has an interest in the matter. A person with knowledge of Charmaine's operations told the Brew Yitzi did go out on calls. He responded to dispatched calls. So for him to say he was a member of the Charmaine means that nobody was a member. Since receiving the Appreciation Award in 2012, Schleifer has repeatedly aligned himself with Charmaine's patrol activities and touted his, quote, law and order credentials. 4 Charmaine officials, Rosenbluth, Diamond, Willer, and Klein, contributed $2,065 to Schleifer's campaign. What's more, Rosenbluth donated his Reisterstown Road eatery, Tove Pizza, to his cousin for use for meetings and other activities. This isn't a pizza place where people talk politics, Schleifer joked to a Baltimore magazine on his surprise primary victory. It is a political clubhouse that sells pizza. Tove Pizza also received a momentary burst of publicity when Rosenbluth hired disgraced Washington lobbyist Jack Abramoff after his 2010 release from prison. And the article goes on to explain how Schleifer supported a raffle that supported the Charmaine. So again, it's particularly important when you talk about family members getting access to one's benefits of one's political influence. But again, this idea of Rosenbluth being a political insider, he was also on the 41st District State Central Committee, and this idea of Tove Pizza being a political clubhouse and a political seat of power for this law and order network, again, not my words, other people's words, to wield its influence. Now, let's take a brief step back and remember that name that was introduced in this article, the person who worked at Tove Pizza after he was released from prison for another corruption scandal in the 2000s, Jack Abramoff. Who is Jack Abramoff? I gotta admit, I'm someone who, by his life's work, has to be engaged in politics. And I vaguely remember the name Jack Abramoff from the Bush years, but looking into his life story, this is one of the most ridiculous cats I've ever seen. Given how serious and terrible the world is, maybe it is useful to just go through a brief tour of Jack Abramoff's greatest hits, or in this case, lowlights. So, starts off Republican political operative in the college Republicans. And one of the things that he does is help create the Citizens for America, a pro-Reagan group designed to help Oliver North build support for the Contras in Nicaragua. So if you remember, Iran, Contra, trading arms for drugs, Reagan, he has helped to manufacture consent for these Contras, these counter-revolutionaries, right-wing paramilitary death squads that wreaked havoc throughout the countryside in Nicaragua in the 80s. This is like his intro to the political scene. So, again, this is just stuff I didn't know. I'm just pulling from Wikipedia here. In '89, he helps to develop a film, Red Scorpion, which is about Africa and about the Soviet Union, which is notorious for assisting African liberation forces in South Africa. In his version of the story, Dolph Lundgren, aka Ivan Drago from the Rocky movies, is working for the Soviets in Africa, realizes how evil they are, and turns against the Soviets to quote-unquote help the poor South Africans. This is just ridiculous Cold War era anti-Soviet propaganda, but apparently through working on some of these films, he gets a connection to Republican Congressperson Tom DeLay, and that helps bring him into the world of Republican lobbying. Can't go into all of his greatest hits of lobbying. He's prolific lobbying for other countries, and he eventually gets indicted and convicted for, amongst other things, taking money from Native American tribes to lobby on their behalf, literally lobbying against their interests and making them pay him more for him to continue to lobby, because he's like, well, if you want good results, you got to pay me more, and then going into meetings telling folks to do the opposite of what the Native Americans paid him to do. Just ridiculous, ridiculous stuff. He's also someone who converts to Orthodox Judaism and is a super Zionist, according to Juan Cole, professor of history at the University of Michigan, in the analysis he does of Abramoff, and specifically the work Abramoff did through his charity, which is the stuff that I think is most relevant to this podcast episode, of literally supporting pro-settler vigilante terrorists and laundering money to them through what is supposed to be his nonprofit. So this is something that Juan Cole writes about the work that Jack Abramoff did to fund resources and weapons for settlers committing acts of violence in occupied Palestine. So he says, quote, "The guilty plea of fabulously wealthy and highly corrupt lobbyist Jack Abramoff raises questions whether he would roll over on congressmen involved in illegal fundraising. The investigation into activities by the FBI has also shed light on the ways in which right-wing American Jews have often been involved in funding what are essentially terrorist activities by armed land thieves in the Palestinian territories. It was the terror funding of Israeli far-right militiamen that tipped Abramoff up since the FBI discovered that he had misled Indian tribes into giving money to a group that had begun wondering if he was defrauding tribes in other ways. The Indian leaders were furious when they discovered that they had used to oppress other dispossessed indigenous people, the Palestinians, calling it outer limits bizarre and saying they would never have willingly given money to such a cause. Newsweek's Mike Isikoff reported last May that Abramoff diverted $140,000 from a charity ostensibly to benefit inner-city youths to militant Israeli colonists who had usurped the land in the Palestinian West Bank. Isikoff wrote, among the expenditures, purchases of camouflage suits, sniper scopes, night vision binoculars, and thermal imagers and other material described in Foundation records as quote-unquote security equipment. The FBI, sources tell Newsweek, is now examining these payments as part of a larger investigation. Abramoff is a fierce supporter of Israel, a quote-unquote super Zionist, one associate says. That may explain why Abramoff's paramilitary gear ended up in the town of Beitar Illit, a sprawling Orthodox outpost where residents have occasionally tangled with their Palestinian neighbors. Isikoff is careful to avoid trouble by depicting the weaponry sent by Abramoff as essentially for self-defense, but the colonists are often aggressive, and anyway would not need to defend themselves if they weren't squatting on other people's land, and Israel does have an army. Private militias are also an ugly thing, and have been used by Israeli communists ethnically to cleanse nearby Palestinian villages. The Hill reported in 2005 that some of the money Abramoff used from the charitable contributions of the Indian tribes, quote, paid a monthly stipend and Jeep payments to a high school friend of Abramoff who conducted sniper workshops. Illegal outposts, i.e. establishing foreign colonies on stolen land, is a way of terrorizing the indigenous inhabitants that requires a local militia to defend the colonists along with sniper lessons and night vision binoculars. Now, here's the thing. If Palestinian Americans have diverted $140,000 from a Muslim charity to purchase security equipment and sniper lessons for Palestinians in the West Bank, that individual will be in Gitmo so fast sonic boom would rattle your windows. End quote. So again, this is the political machine in Northwest Baltimore. It's not folks who happen to be Zionists, who happen to have political opinions. These are folks who are deeply tied into, of all things, Republican, ultra-Orthodox, right-wing political networks. I don't think many folks in Baltimore know this, that the political machine that is pushing this Democratic candidate for state senate in Baltimore City has ties to one of the most notorious Republican, ultra-Zionist, lobbyist, corrupt individuals. He was actually indicted again in 2020 for going back to his old ways and pushing lobbying for crypto scandals. But again, this is not conjecture. In the FBI report on the accusation of blackmail, it specifically gives a no-contact order between the police officer who was accused of helping to plant these devices and do this tracking, Carmen Finkelstein, and Ronnie Rosenbluth. So this network tied to Dahlia Tarr, tied to this Democratic senator who, again, her number one fear was being perceived as too soft on police by wanting to give basic accountability to police, to the point where she would help instigate this entire potential alleged Rube Goldberg-esque regime of surveillance around a potential political opponent, is supported by a regime that is willing to give aid and comfort to a Republican political operative, Jack Abramoff, tied to literally funding people doing sniper lessons in the West Bank. So this idea of there being a direct tie between Zionism and what's happening in Northwest Baltimore right now is not conjecture. And it's not even just the Democratic Party. It is a larger bipartisan regime of racialized social control, tying itself directly into Northwest Baltimore. So who are the other players? What does this mean concretely? What does this mean for the work black folks are doing? to try to build out alternatives to policing? What does this mean for the election coming up? What are some of the examples of this political regime materially impacting politics at a local level? And what can we do to challenge that control of local politics? So we're going to end part 1 here. And we will go to part 2, where we will go deeper into some of these questions, reveal some of the ways that some of the characters from this episode reappear in local politics, some of the ways in which this clash between the black folks trying to control their communities, how we get a very different media and community depiction of that than when Jewish folks try to patrol and protect their communities.